Hey, lifers, Dustin here, and after 12 weeks of the college football season, it's time to take a look at the Heisman Watch Top 10. So we're going to first look at last week's bubble players and how they did, then last week's Top 10 and how they did, and then this week's bubble players, I will kind of unveil them, which is a really fancy word, meaning put them on the screen for you to see. And then I will do the same thing with my top 10, kind of counting it down to build some fake sense of suspense, even though I have Baker Mayfield 1, so there's no real point in doing that. But as always, as I'm going through this list, with only 2 weeks left, but only 1 week of the regular season left, I'm very curious to know what your top 5 would look like, so make sure to let me know that down below in the comments section. And let me know if anything is out of whack in these rankings, which you always do, and I appreciate it. So let's get started with last week's bubble players. We'll start, and we'll go in alphabetical order. I had Riley Ferguson, who went 21 of 27 for 320 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a pick. He also ran the ball 29 times for 3 touchdowns, and on the season, he's 239 of 386, good for 61.9% completion percentage, 3,201 yards, 29 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, and 6 rushing touchdowns, meaning he had half of that in one game. Kerryon Johnson of Auburn against UL Monroe in a game where Auburn kind of struggled early, ran it 22 times for 137 yards and a touchdown, bringing his season totals to 220 rushes for 1,172 yards, good for 5.3 yards per carry, 16 touchdowns, 18 receptions, 166 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He has a huge statement game this week. Rashad Penny of San Diego State, who got left off the Doak Walker Awards finals list, ran it 24 times for 222 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had 1 reception for 6 yards, a kickoff for a touchdown, and a punt return for a touchdown on his first ever attempt. And I believe his grandmother actually passed away either that morning or that weekend. So it was a big game for him, an emotional game for him, and he showed out. On the season now, he has 253 rushes for 1,824 yards, good for 7.2 yards per carry, 17 touchdowns, 18 receptions, 142 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 kickoff returns for a touchdown, and a punt return for a touchdown. Malik Rozier in the big game against Virginia went 15 of 28 for 210 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 picks. The interceptions still plague him a little bit. He's ran the ball 9 times for 38 yards and a touchdown in that game. On the season, he's 184 of 326, good for only 56.4% completion percentage, 2,620 yards, 23 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, and he has 377 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns. Khalil Tate in a game against Oregon was held in check. He actually had way more passing yards than rushing yards. We haven't been able to say that very often this year. He went 18 of 35 for 159 yards, a touchdown, and 2 picks. Ran the ball only 14 times for 32 yards. Apparently, Oregon had scouted him pretty good coming into that game. On the season, his stats are 83 of 140, good for only 59.3% completion percentage, 1,157 yards, 9 touchdowns, 8 picks, 1,325 rushing yards, and 11 touchdowns. As we move into the top 10 from last week, at number 10, I had Lamar Jackson. All he did was go 14 of 26 for 270 yards and 2 touchdowns, ran the ball 12 times for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns. His stats are absolutely unbelievable, and if he didn't have a team that didn't look competitive in the biggest games of the year, this would be a much different season for him. On the season, his stats are 226 of 378, good for 59.8% completion percentage, still not great, 3,273 yards, 23 touchdowns, and only 6 picks. That is in addition to 1,287 rushing yards and 17 rushing touchdowns, which is absurd. At number 9, I had Will Grier, who I thought may have a big statement game against Texas going into the Oklahoma game, but he was injured after only going 6 of 8 for 50 yards. He'll finish the season, unless he plays in a bowl game, at 250 of 388, good for 64.4% completion percentage, 3,490 yards, 34 touchdowns, 12 interceptions, 122 rushing yards, and 2 touchdowns. That is a tough loss for this Mountaineers team. At number 8, I had Josh Adams, who ran it 18 times for 106 yards against Navy. Not the best, not the worst. On the season, he has 171 rushes for 1,337 yards, good for 7.8 yards per carry, and 9 touchdowns. At number 7, I had Trace McSorley, who against Nebraska went 24 of 36 for 325 yards, 3 touchdowns, 46 rushing yards, and a touchdown. On the season, he's 230 of 353, good for 65.2% completion percentage, 2,991 yards, 24 touchdowns, 8 picks, 3-to-1 ratio there, 395 rushing yards, and 10 rushing touchdowns. At number 6, I had Saquon Barkley, who did find a groove a little bit. He actually found some room to run in this game against the Cornhuskers. He ran it 17 times for 158 yards, 3 touchdowns, 6 receptions for 66 yards. Okay. On the season, he has 183 rushes for 1,057 yards, passing that 4-digit milestone, good for 5.8 yards per carry, 14 touchdowns, 46 receptions, 590 yards, 3 touchdowns, 2 kickoff returns for a touchdown, and a passing touchdown. Him and Rashad Penny battling it out for the most versatile back in the country. At number 5, you had Jonathan Taylor, who had a big game against Michigan, running it 19 times for 132 yards in the Badgers' win. On the season, he has 238 rushes for 1,657 yards, good for 7 yards per carry, 12 touchdowns, 4 receptions, and 52 yards. At number 4, Ronald Jones II in the big game rivalry game against UCLA, ran it 28 times for 122 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 reception for 22 yards, and on the season he ran it 212 times for 1,346 yards, good for 6.3 yards per carry, 16 touchdowns, 13 receptions, 181 yards, and a touchdown. Getting into the top 3, Mason Rudolph of Oklahoma State in the comeback against Kansas State was able to make his stats look really good because they threw the ball a lot in the fourth quarter. He's 32 of 53 for 425 yards, 3 touchdowns, 2 picks, and a rushing touchdown. On the season, he's 266 of 414, giving him a 64.3% completion percentage, 4,115 yards, 33 touchdowns, 9 picks, and an additional 8 rushing touchdowns. At number 2 is Bryce Love, and in the big game, he went 14 rushes for 101 yards and a touchdown, and a little reception for 2 yards. On the season, he has 195 rushes for 1,723 yards, good for 8.8 yards per carry, 16 touchdowns, 6 receptions, and 33 yards. And at number 1, Baker Mayfield, he had a day. It was very memorable. It was not memorable for his 20 of 30 for 257 yards and 3 touchdown performance. On the season, he's 233 of 329, good for a country-best 70.8% completion percentage, 3,816 yards, 34 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, 240 rushing yards, and 5 rushing touchdowns. Now, if we look at the bubble players for the upcoming week, I have Jake Browning making a reappearance on this list, Riley Ferguson, Kerryon Johnson, Mackenzie Milton, and Khalil Tate. For the record, I really want to put Kerryon Johnson on the top 10. I can't take anyone off to put in there. I can't figure out any person to replace him with. Let me know in the comment section who I should replace him with. Now, if you look at the top 10 of this week, at number 10, I have Josh Adams moving back 2 spots. He's number 6 in yards per attempt, but that is about it on the national scale, and he hasn't come up the biggest Irish games of the year. Number 9, I have Trace McSorley dropping back 2 as well. Number 8 is the ever-snubbed Rashad Penny, who was not ranked last week. He was a bubble player. He's 1st in rushing yards in the country, 3rd in rushing touchdowns, and 2nd in non-quarterback scoring. Pretty impressive. At number 7, I have Saquon Barkley moving back another spot. He's number 5 in scoring, but Saquon is actually suffering, I think, a little bit from, even though I do think he's going to end up being a Heisman finalist, I think he suffers a little bit from what Jabril Peppers at Michigan had last year, where he does a lot of things really good. And I do think overall he's probably the best player in the country, but none of his stats really dominate. And to win the Heisman, you should be extraordinarily good at one thing and then be able to be versatile in other areas. And his numbers just aren't quite there. They were, and then something happened for 3 weeks, and now he's down to number 7 in my poll. At number 6, I have Lamar Jackson, who jumped up 4. I realize my bias. I've been penalizing the team and not the player. His stats, I just can't stop. Like, his stats are just too good. Like, he doesn't deserve what is going on in Louisville right now. He's number 10 in passing yards in the country, number 3 in rushing touchdowns. He's just a highlight machine week in and week out. And I've been snubbing him, and I apologize for that. Lamar, if you're watching, I'm sorry. Number 5, I have Jonathan Taylor staying put. He's number 3 in the country in rushing yards. Number 10 in the country in rushing yards is the person ahead of him, and Ronald Jones the second, but he's number 7 in rushing touchdowns, and he's a better receiver than Jonathan Taylor. And number 3, I have Bryce Love, who dropped back one spot. He's number 2 in the country in rush yards, number 3 in yards per attempt, and number 7 in rushing touchdowns. But the 2 guys ahead of him are, in my opinion, better, and that is Mason Rudolph, who moved up one spot, and Baker Mayfield, who stays at number 1 for me. Between the 2 of them, they are number 1 and 2 in passing yards. They are 1 and 4 in yards per attempt, 1 and 4 in passer rating and passing touchdowns, 2 and 4 in passing touchdowns, and 1 and 7 in passing percentage and completions. The higher number of all of those is Baker Mayfield, except passing yards. Mason Rudolph does have more passing yards than Baker Mayfield at the moment. So let's talk about this for just a split second. I don't know how much people think about character when they are casting their ballot for the Heisman Trophy. We've had some, I don't want to use the word sketchy, that's too strong, but some troubled players in the past that have won it as far as personality goes. We had Johnny Manziel, who was extraordinarily arrogant and brash and had the issue about signing autographs. We had Jameis Winston, who was off the field, seemed to be a pretty not great person at Florida State at times, very immature. There were allegations about sexual misconduct when he was there. The whole stealing crab legs, the whole standing up at the cafeteria and shouting a profanity that cost him the Clemson game. Then you had Cam Newton, who was alleged to have been paid to go to Auburn, who got kicked out of Florida for stealing a laptop. So we've had players just in the last, 7 years that have had some character issues. I mean, none of them were like really hurting somebody, unless the Jameis Winston one was true, but that never really panned out. So the question is, will Baker Mayfield suffer because of those players, or will he still get the Heisman because he's probably the best player at what he does? He's the best quarterback in the country right now, as far as a college quarterback, not projecting forward into the NFL. He's the best player in college football right now at what he does. Week in and week out, he hasn't had a bad week. He just shows up and performs. But the thing that he did against Kansas, we all know what I'm talking about. That's not something that if I was a Heisman voter, I would want to vote for. But can you separate what goes on off the field? You know, he had some issues this past, I think it was this past offseason with a DUI. Can you separate that from the player? How much are you voting for the man? How much are you voting for the player? That's going to be something really interesting to kind of think about and analyze over the next week or two until they announce the actual finalists and the Heisman Trophy itself, because I'm not sure I would vote for him even though I have him number 1. Does that make sense? Because of the character issue, it'll be interesting to see what the voters do. There are going to be voters who don't care, just like there are fans. I was on Twitter Saturday during the Kansas game. There were a lot of fans that did not care that Baker Mayfield did it, that they thought he was savage AF. I'm sorry for saying that, but that they were like, he's a hero, he's the man, look at him go. And it's like, no, he's an idiot. Shut up, Baker, stop. Like, I understand Kansas did some stuff. They did a late hit that kind of hurt his shoulder. But if you're going to win the Heisman Trophy, you can't do crap like that. And it'll be really interesting to see how much the Heisman Trophy voters care, how much they still think he's the best, and if it'll cost him the Heisman Trophy. So that was my little spiel about that moment. I do still have him number 1. Let me know down in the comment section, obviously your top 5. And even if you have Baker 1, would you vote for him? And be objective. You're an Oklahoma fan, whatever. I get it. But would you vote for somebody, if you were a Heisman Trophy voter and your biggest rival's quarterback did that, would you vote for him for the Heisman Trophy? That's kind of the way to look at it, I guess, where you're the most unbiased. Anyway, let me know that down below. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to give it a big thumbs up. You can also click the circle right there in order to subscribe or watch any of the other videos over there to the right that YouTube has suggested for you. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, until next time. Hey lifers, Dustin here, and after 12 weeks of the college football season, it's time to take a look at the Heisman Watch Top 10. So we're going to first look at last week's bubble players and how they did, then last week's Top 10 and how they did, and then this week in these rankings, which you always do, and I appreciate it. So let's get started with last week's bubble players. We'll start, and we'll go in alphabetical order. I had Riley Ferguson, who went 21 of 27 for 320 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a pick. He also ran the ball 29 times for 3 touchdowns, and on the season, he's 239. But as always, as I'm going through this list, with only 2 weeks left, but only 1 week of the regular season left, I'm very curious to know what your top 5 would look like, so make sure to let me know that down below in the comments section, and yeah, let me know if anything is out of whack. 9 of 386, good for 61.9% completion percentage, 3,201 yards, 29 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, and 6 rushing touchdowns, meaning he had half of that in 1 game. Kerryon Johnson of Auburn against UL Monroe. And bubble players, I will kind of unveil them, which is a really fancy word, meaning put them on the screen for you to see. And then I will do the same thing with my top 10, kind of counting it down to build some fake sense of suspense, even though I have Baker Mayfield 1, so there's no real point in doing that.